All right, let's dive deep into these Pope Francis comments, the ones about the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
We've got this Euromaidan press article, and then, of course, got to check out what folks are saying on Reddit, right? So we can kind of see, like, all sides of how people are reacting to this.
Yeah, and it's kind of wild, right? Like one statement from the Pope and boom, everyone's got an opinion.
Exactly. So this Euromaidan press article, it, like, breaks down, what the Pope's actually saying, and it seems like he's really criticizing European countries, for sending weapons to Ukraine. He's saying,
Yeah.
basically, it's hypocritical to be talking about peace, but then, arming a country for war.
Yeah, and that's where I think it gets really, really interesting because IS saying, let's have these peace talks, but then, like, he kind of stops short of saying, hey, Russia, you got to get your troops out of there.
Right.
And he doesn't explicitly say, free all those Ukrainians who've been deported.
Yeah, and it's those little things where I guess, the lack of those things, that seems to be what's riling people up on Reddit.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There's definitely some frustration there. Like, why isn't he, like, straight up condemning what Russia's doing?
Yeah.
Especially with everything, that's happened, all the horrible stuff.
Totally. There's a bunch of comments saying, come on, why isn't he more direct about this? And then, there's that whole, like, irony thing people are pointing out.
Yeah, what's that?
Like the Catholic Church talking about morality when, hello, they've had their own share of scandals and, violence and stuff throughout history.
Yeah. I mean, it makes you think, right? Like, does who's saying something affect how you hear it?
For sure, for sure. But hold on, there's this other part that I thought was, kind of interesting, the way he's comparing Ukrainian men and Russian men.
What do you say?
He's saying that Ukraine has, like, few men left, while Russia has many.
Oh, wow. And that's pretty thought-provoking because, like,
Yeah,
on the surface, it just sounds like he's, acknowledging the losses on both sides, but it doesn't really deal with the fact that, one side is the one who started this whole thing and the other's, the victim.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. So by not, like, pointing that out, it almost kind of makes things a little fuzzy, like,
Yeah.
morally speaking.
Exactly. Like, it just muddies the waters, and it kind of plays into that whole, pacifism versus intervention thing, right? Like, can you really be all about peace, but not, like, acknowledge the fact that there's this huge injustice at the heart of it all?
And that's kind of what I think the Euromaidan press article is getting at. They're saying that if we go with, a peace deal that's negotiated, like the Pope seems to be suggesting, it could just end up, like, legitimizing Russia just taking over Ukrainian territory.
Right. That's exactly it. And a lot of people on Reddit are picking up on that too. Like, they're worried that if we just rush into peace, without dealing with, like, justice and who's accountable for what, it might actually make things worse in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there's all this talk about, what's happened in the past, too, on Reddit.
Oh, really? What kind of stuff?
Like, several people are comparing, what the Pope's saying to, like, when dictators were appeased in the past.
Yeah, and it's not a bad comparison. I mean, history kind of shows us that, like, giving in to an aggressor doesn't usually work out too well, especially, when they've shown that they don't care about international rules or whatever.
So what we're seeing here is, like, this clash between, like, the ideal of peace and, like, the reality of this super complicated and messy conflict, right?
Yeah, it's almost like the Pope is looking at it from this, like, really theoretical peace perspective. And then you've got folks on Reddit who are more focused on, like, what'll actually happen, the consequences and stuff. And both of those ways of looking at it, they've got their own, complicated stuff going on.
Yeah, and there was this quote that really jumped out at me. He said, "We organize conferences and meetings, yet we continue producing weapons to kill."
Wow.
And it's like, it just lays it all out there, how he feels about the arms industry and all of that.
And I think a lot of people, no matter where they stand on this whole Ukraine thing, they can relate to that, right?
Yeah.
It's like, are we all talk and no action when it comes to peace?
Yeah, it's true. It's like we're all stuck in this contradiction.
How do you mean?
Like, we want peace, but then we also want to be safe. We say violence is bad, but then we arm ourselves like crazy.
Yeah, that's true. And that same kind of back and forth is happening on Reddit too. Lots of discussion about whether it's, right or wrong to give weapons to Ukraine.
Right. Some people are like, it's self-defense, duh. But then others are like, you're just adding fuel to the fire. It's a tough one for sure. No easy answers. Yeah, and it's a debate that's been going on forever, right? Like, do you fight back even if it means, getting violent yourself? Or do you stick to, like, pacifism no matter what, even if it means, maybe injustice wins? Ugh. Tough stuff.
Yeah, big questions for sure. And I think whether he meant to or not, the Pope's kind of brought those questions, front and center with this whole thing.
Totally. So we've got the Pope calling for peace, but not really saying like Russia's in the wrong. And then you've got people questioning his motives and, if the church can even talk about morality. And then on top of it all, those comparisons to like appeasement, it's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
And then, we've also got to figure out what peace even means in this situation, right? Like, is it just that the fighting stops or is it something, bigger?
Right. And then who gets to decide what that bigger thing is?
Exactly. Is it the countries who are, in the middle of it all? Or is it like the whole world? Or, in this case, does the Pope, like as a religious leader, does he get to like shape the conversation?
Yeah, it's a sticky situation. And honestly, I don't think there's a simple answer.
But what I do think is interesting is that because the Pope said this and because people are reacting so strongly, it's made us really face these questions.
Yeah, totally. You can't ignore them anymore.
Exactly. And that's kind of the point of this whole deep dive, right? It's not about finding the right answer. It's more about, trying to understand all the complicated parts and realizing that there are like lots of different ways of looking at it. So you've got some people saying peace is like the most important thing no matter what. And then you've got others who are like, sometimes you got to fight to get real peace, the kind that lasts. And it seems like from what he said, the Pope's more on, the pacifist side of things.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And it's worth pointing out, this isn't really new for him. He's talked about, being against war and violence a lot since he became Pope. But this time, I think because of when he said it, the war's still going on, it's really hit a nerve.
And it's definitely sparked a lot of debate, like, we saw in that Reddit thread.
Definitely.
So I guess as we, kind of wrap up this part, what do you think people listening should, like, take away from this? What should they be thinking about, after hearing all of this?
Well, I think the big thing is there's no easy answer when it comes to war and peace. We can't just, use slogans or easy solutions. We've got to be willing to deal with the messy parts and see that there are moral questions and that different people can have valid points, even if they don't agree.
Yeah, and I think we can't forget that, with all the politics and, like, big ideas being thrown around, there are real people whose lives are, being totally changed by this.
Exactly. So as you're going about your day, think about the people who are suffering because of this war and all the hard choices that are being made and what, your responsibility might be to try to make the world a more peaceful place.
Wow. Deep stuff. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive. It's given me a lot to think about for sure.
Yeah, me too. It might help to, think about this whole thing, historically, this idea of a just war. It's been debated forever.
Okay, so break that down for me a bit. What exactly does that, just war theory mean?
Well, basically, it's trying to figure out, when is it actually okay, morally speaking, to go to war, and then how should you fight that war? There are these principles, like just cause, which means you can't just go around invading places for no reason. You got to have a good reason, like you're defending yourself.
Right. So, I mean, in this case, Ukraine's defending itself against, Russia, so that would seem to fit that just cause thing, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. But then there's this other principle called proportionality, which basically means, you shouldn't use more force than you need to, based on the threat. And that's where things get a little complicated, especially when we're talking about, giving weapons to one side.
So you're saying even if, the reason for going to war is a good one, there are still, moral questions about how you fight the war.
Exactly. And you see that tension, playing out in what the Pope's saying and how people are reacting to it. Like, he seems to be putting peace, as an absolute above everything else, even if it means, kind of compromising on things like justice or, a country's right to decide its own future.
But some people might say that you can't really have peace, real peace, if you don't deal with the things that are unfair in the first place. If you just ignore them so everyone will stop fighting, aren't you just setting things up for another war later? Yeah, that's a good point. It goes back to that question we were talking about before. What does peace really mean?
Yeah.
Is it just that no one's shooting anymore? Or is it more than that?
And who gets to decide what that more is? Is it the countries who are fighting? Or the rest of the world? Or, in this case, does the Pope, since he's, a religious leader, does he get to be the one to decide?
It's a tough one. And honestly, I don't think there's a simple answer. But what's interesting to me is how, because the Pope said what he said and people have reacted so strongly. It's like we're forced to think about these questions.
It's like he, threw a bomb into this already heated argument, and whether you agree with him or not, you can't just ignore it. You have to deal with it.
Exactly. And I think that's like the real value of this whole deep dive. It's not about being right, but more about like understanding how complicated this is and that there are lots of different ways of looking at it and they can all be valid.
So we've got people who think peace should be the goal no matter what, and then others who think, like, sometimes you got to fight to get to real peace, the kind that lasts. And it sounds like the Pope, from what he said, is more on the, peace at any cost side of things.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And it's worth noting that, this isn't something new for him. He's been talking about being against war and violence, pretty much since he became Pope. But this time, I don't know, maybe because the war is still going on, it's just like, hit a nerve.
And it sparked some pretty heated debate, like we saw on that Reddit thread.
Definitely.
So I guess as we, wrap up this part, what do you think our listeners should, take away from all this? What should they be thinking about?
Well, I think the big thing is that there's no easy answer. When it comes to war and peace, we can't just fall back on slogans, or simple solutions. We got to be willing to engage with the messy parts, acknowledge the moral questions, and, recognize that there are different perspectives and they can all be valid.
Mm-hmm. And maybe even more importantly, we've got to remember that, with all the politics and everything, there are real people whose lives are being totally changed by this war.
Absolutely. So as you're going about your day, think about the human cost of this war, all the difficult choices being made, and, what you think your responsibility might be in trying to make the world a more peaceful and just place.
Wow, powerful stuff. Thanks for, taking us on this deep dive. It's given me a lot to think about. It just hit me, as we're talking about all this, the Pope's statement and, how everyone's reacting, it kind of shows you how limited words can be.
What do you mean?
Especially when you're trying to talk about something as, complex and messed up as war.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Words can be powerful, but they can also be, slippery.
Mm-hmm.
What they mean can totally change depending on, who's saying them, who's listening, and, the whole situation.
Exactly. So here you've got the Pope, right? Speaking from this place of, moral authority, calling for peace, but then, what does that actually mean, in the real world? How do you take this big idea and turn it into, something you actually do?
Yeah, that's where it gets tough, right? Because peace can be this really, abstract thing. It can mean different things to different people.
Yeah.
For some, it might just be that the fighting stops.
Right.
But for others, it might be about, getting justice, making sure people are held accountable, or making sure everyone's rights are respected, stuff like that.
And that's what makes this whole conversation so hard,
Yeah.
It's not just that people have different opinions. It's they have totally different ideas about what the end goal should even be.
It's like we're all speaking English, but we're using totally different dictionaries.
Right.
And that can lead to, a lot of misunderstandings and people getting frustrated.
Which brings us back to, the Pope's statement and all the different ways people reacted. Some heard him calling for peace and they were like, okay, great, no matter what else he said. But others heard the exact same words and thought, wait, is he saying we should just give in? Or is he taking Russia's side?
And you know what? Both of those ways of seeing it make sense, given, how complicated this whole thing is. And I think it shows how important it is to not just, listen to the words, but also, think about who's saying them, who are they talking to, and, the whole picture.
It's we got to be aware of all the stuff that's, not being said,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
All the history, the politics, the emotions, all of that.
Totally. And that's why I think it's so important to, think about these things in a way that's, nuanced, to not just jump to conclusions or go for easy answers that don't really solve anything.
So as we, kind of wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought, something to really think about.
Okay, I'm ready.
Imagine Pope Francis goes to Ukraine, right now.
Well, okay.
What would he say to the people there? The ones who are actually living through this war, the ones who are suffering the most.
And you know what? What would they say back to him? What would they want him to know? What questions would they ask him?
It's a powerful thing to think about, because it makes you go beyond just what people say and these theoretical arguments. And it brings you face to face with the real human side of this whole thing.
Yeah, it reminds us that behind all the news and politics and everything, there are real people whose lives have been completely changed by this war. and their stories, what they've gone through, it deserves to be heard.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's giving you something to think about and maybe, a better understanding of this whole situation. It's complicated and it's always changing, but we'll keep digging into these important topics. See you next time.